Hi Founder fans, Jason here, and today's founder is John Ashley. Now I'll remind you, I am traveling to visit family this week, and I am actually shooting this video from my childhood bedroom, though my younger brother did live here for about a decade in between. Anyway, John Ashley was the person who was a leader of Western Massachusetts in 1773 when things were getting a little bit intolerable with the Intolerable Acts, and it was at his house, we believe, that several men got together, discussed the issues at hand, and wrote the Sheffield Resolves. Sometimes called the Sheffield Declaration, but most commonly known as the Sheffield Resolves. These were a series of grievances, as well as, we'll call them demands, that were written and signed by 11 leaders of Sheffield, Massachusetts, and sent to a man named David Ingersoll, who was Sheffield's representative at the Massachusetts State Legislature, or at the time, Colonial Legislature. So, these gentlemen write these resolves, send them out. They have Ingersoll bring them to the attention of the Colonial Assembly, as well as have them published in Boston. And actually, they radicalized a lot of people in Boston who were already unhappy with what was going on, but now they're realizing, wait a minute, you mean the farmers out west are upset about this too? Oh, then maybe we need to start doing something. So, they did go out. Now, this is essentially where John Ashley's service to the country kind of fades. As a leading citizen, he did continue as a justice of the Court of Common Pleas out west. But the Sheffield Resolves, first of all, have a lot of similar language to the Declaration of Independence. And furthermore, they have one grievance at the end where they're actually complaining about New York State that they want Ingersoll to bring up. And their complaint about New York State is that New York State claimed it had everything up to the Connecticut River, which would have included Sheffield and would have made Sheffield part of New York. And considering the people of Sheffield had representation in the Massachusetts colonial government, but no representation in the New York colonial government, the people of Sheffield did not like this. And further interesting is it was this claim toward the Connecticut River that made the people of Vermont upset about literally exactly the same issue with New York State, although at the time New Hampshire thought they owned Vermont also, but that's a different story. Lastly, what's really exciting, or I should say interesting, about the Sheffield Resolves is the person who wrote them was a young man named Theodore Sedgwick, and we are not going to get entirely into Theodore Sedgwick's life. We will make entire videos about Sedgwick and his life because he had humongous contributions to the American Revolution. But John Ashley was one of the wealthiest people in Western Massachusetts, and he had a slave. He had several slaves at a time where in Massachusetts even the wealthiest people had a handful of slaves, not the plantations of the South, but they did have slaves. One of these slaves went by the name Mumbet. And it was more than likely that it was during this discussion where, as I said, Theodore Sedgwick was the one who wrote the Sheffield Resolves. And in it, he wrote things that sounded like the Declaration of Independence, about being equal and independent, about having a right to life and liberty. And it probably did not fall on deaf ears for Sedgwick that he was in a house that owned slaves while he was writing this. And he probably met Mumbet on this occasion, perhaps earlier, but definitely by this point he would have met Mumbet. And it would be several years later, in the early 1780s, when Mumbet would show up at Theodore Sedgwick's door. The same man who wrote the Sheffield Resolves in her house. She would show up at his door and say, hey, the new Massachusetts Constitution says all men are created equal. Does that mean slavery is illegal in this state? And it would be Theodore Sedgwick who would take on this case and win the initial case that led to not only the freeing of Mumbet, who would later go by the name Elizabeth Freeman, but the abolition of slavery entirely from Massachusetts State during these early years of the American Revolution. And again, it all goes to this meeting at what we believe was the house of John Ashley. So that's the story of John Ashley. I know we stray from his life a little bit with this, but that's really the story of the Sheffield Resolves. And they're an amazingly important early step. There were many, many resolves throughout the colonies at this point leading up to the American Revolution, preparing us for revolution. And the Sheffield Resolves is an extremely important one, not just because how it riled people up then, but how it set a young man, Theodore Sedgwick, on the way to essentially push Massachusetts towards total abolition in the 1780s. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, hit like. Tomorrow I will be back at my house and we will have our live video, so don't worry about all this. I apologize for not shooting enough videos ahead of time, but that's going to happen from time to time. I'm here a little bit longer than I anticipated. There's some storms coming through that I did not want to drive through. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll be back to you with a live video tomorrow.